In the 1970s, a boutique opened on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills that Guinness World Records would eventually certify as the most expensive store on earth, a title based not on the price of any single item, but on the sales generated per square foot of retail space. The store was called Bijan, and it operated almost entirely by appointment only. Walk up to the door without one, and in many cases you simply couldn't get in at all. A locked entrance, a doorbell, a member of staff deciding whether to let you inside. The showroom itself held remarkably little visible merchandise, a handful of suits, a few accessories, most of the space simply empty, quiet, deliberately underfurnished compared to what you would expect from a store charging what it charged. Founder Bijan Pakzad reportedly turned away walk-in customers regularly, including, according to widely repeated industry stories, people who could easily have afforded anything in the building simply because they hadn't been expected. And yet, this nearly empty, appointment-gated boutique on a single stretch of one street was, for years, reportedly generating more revenue per square foot than almost any retail space in the world, malls, department stores, entire shopping districts included. That number should stop you because it runs directly against everything you'd assume about how a store makes money. Every instinct you have about retail says more customers, more inventory, more foot traffic, more sales. A store that's empty most of the day with a doorman deciding who gets in should be failing, not breaking sales per square foot records. But Bijan wasn't an anomaly. It was an unusually extreme, unusually well-documented example of a pattern that runs through nearly all serious luxury retail. And once you understand why an empty store can be one of the most profitable pieces of real estate on the planet, you'll never walk past a hushed, half-lit boutique with 3 items in the window the same way again. My name is Alex, and I spend a strange amount of time reading commercial real estate reports and luxury retail trade publications because it turns out the emptiness you're seeing through that glass storefront isn't a symptom of the business struggling. In almost every case, it's the business working exactly as designed. Here's what we're covering today: the actual real estate economics behind why a luxury flagship can occupy some of the most expensive commercial space on earth while looking, from the sidewalk, like almost nobody's inside. The deliberate staffing ratio luxury retailers use, the exact opposite of how a mass market store staffs its floor, and why having more employees than customers is a feature, not an inefficiency. The reason so little merchandise is ever visible on the actual sales floor, and what's really happening in the back room every time a salesperson disappears for several minutes before returning with a single item. The controversial, sometimes literally locked door practice of controlling who gets to enter a luxury boutique in the first place. And the invisible half of the business, the appointment only, by referral clientele that generates the majority of actual revenue, while the visible walk-in storefront mostly exists as something else entirely. This isn't a video about luxury pricing. We've covered that ground elsewhere. This is about the physical retail environment itself, the empty floor, the hushed atmosphere, the sense that you might be intruding just by walking in. Because that entire experience is constructed just as deliberately as the price tag is, and almost nobody who walks through those doors realizes how much engineering went into making the room feel the way it does. Quick thing, before we get into it. I put together a free guide that walks through exactly how to get real, attentive service at a luxury boutique as a first-time or occasional shopper based on how these stores actually structure staff incentives internally so you're not left standing awkwardly by the door. Links in the description. I only asked for an email to send you the guide. Picture the difference between a museum gallery and a big box discount store. Walk into the discount store and every inch of space is packed. Shelves floor to ceiling, products stacked in the aisles. The entire visual message screaming abundance. Quantity, more for your money. Walk into a museum gallery and you'll often find a single painting on an enormous wall, surrounded by nothing but empty space and soft, deliberate lighting. The emptiness around that painting isn't a failure to fill the room. It's the entire point. The empty space tells your brain, before you've even looked closely at the object itself, that whatever is sitting inside that emptiness must be significant enough to deserve it. A luxury store borrows this exact logic wholesale. The empty floor, the single handbag displayed on a pedestal under its own dedicated light, the vast unused square footage between one rack of clothing and the next. Every luxury retailer knows precisely what a supermarket knows about abundance signaling density and value. They're just applying the opposite lesson, on purpose, because scarcity of visible product signals something a crowded shelf never could. Let's talk about the actual real estate math behind this, because the numbers involved are genuinely staggering once you see them laid out. Retail space on streets like Fifth Avenue in New York, Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills or Bond Street in London command some of the highest commercial rents on the planet. Figures that have, in various commercial real estate reports over the years, run into many thousands of dollars per square foot annually for the most sought after storefronts. A mass market retailer occupying that kind of space would need an enormous, continuous flow of foot traffic and transactions just to cover the base rent before a single dollar of profit gets generated. A luxury flagship covers that same rent through an entirely different mechanism. Extraordinarily high margin per transaction rather than volume of transactions. If a single handbag sale generates a profit margin that a mass retailer would need to sell hundreds of units of a cheaper product to match, the store simply doesn't need the foot traffic that a mall retailer requires to justify its lease. This changes the entire calculation of what the physical space is even for. It stops needing to maximize the number of people who can be served at once and starts needing to maximize the quality and duration of attention given to the relatively small number of people who do walk in. This reframes the emptiness entirely. An empty luxury store isn't failing to attract customers the way an empty mass market store would be. It's a space engineered around a completely different volume assumption from the outset, sized and staffed for a trickle of extremely high-value transactions rather than a flood of ordinary ones, which means the same emptiness that would signal financial distress in a typical retail context signals something closer to the opposite here, a business model that was never trying to fill the room in the first place. Now let's talk about staffing, because this is where the logic gets genuinely counterintuitive if you're used to how ordinary retail operates. A typical mass market clothing store aims for a staff to customer ratio that keeps labor costs as low as possible relative to sales volume, often meaning a handful of employees covering a large floor with dozens of shoppers moving through at once, each getting minimal individual attention because the economics simply don't support anything more. Luxury boutiques deliberately invert this ratio. It's not unusual for a high-end store to have as many or more staff present on the floor than customers at almost any given moment during a normal business day. This isn't inefficiency or poor scheduling. It's the entire service model. Each staff member, often called a client advisor rather than a salesperson in internal company language, is expected to give a single customer sustained, essentially undivided attention for however long that customer is in the store, sometimes well over an hour for a significant purchase, building a personal rapport that has almost nothing to do with efficiently moving through as many transactions as possible in a shift. This staffing model only makes financial sense because of the margin structure underneath it. A single successful client relationship at this level, one that results in a customer returning repeatedly over years, referring friends, being invited to private events, can generate revenue that dwarfs what dozens of quick, low-attention transactions would produce in a conventional retail setting. Many luxury retail compensation structures reflect this directly, with client advisors earning commission tied not just to a single sale but to the ongoing relationship and repeat business with specific named clients they've cultivated, sometimes over years, which gives staff every incentive to spend an enormous amount of unhurried time with a promising customer, rather than rushing to serve the next person waiting, because there frequently isn't anyone else waiting. And even if there were, the math still favors depth over volume. Let's talk about what's actually happening in the back room, because a sparse, half-empty sales floor is often hiding something the customer rarely sees directly. Many luxury boutiques, particularly for their most coveted or highest value items, deliberately keep the vast majority of available inventory out of sight entirely, stored in a back room or stock room rather than displayed on the floor. When a client advisor disappears after a few minutes of conversation and returns with a single item, that's rarely because the item simply happened to be in the back for storage convenience. It's frequently a deliberate piece of theater, a small ritual of presentation where the item is brought out individually, unwrapped or unboxed with visible care, presented almost ceremonially rather than simply pointed to on an open shelf. This accomplishes several things simultaneously. It reinforces the earlier point about scarcity. If the item isn't sitting in plain view, it must be special enough to warrant special handling. It creates a moment of anticipation and individual attention that a self-service shelf could never replicate. And it gives staff a natural opportunity to control exactly what gets shown and in what order, steering a browsing customer towards specific pieces based on a read of their interest, their budget signals, or simply what the store most wants to move that particular week, all without the customer ever seeing the full range of options sitting on a shelf where they might make their own independent comparison. This connects to something genuinely uncomfortable that has surfaced repeatedly in industry reporting and, on occasion, in actual legal disputes: the practice of controlling who gets through the door in the first place. Several luxury retailers across different countries and different brands have faced documented accusations over the years of staff making snap judgments about a potential customer's appearance, dress, or perceived background before deciding whether to unlock a door, buzz someone in, or offer prompt versus delayed service. Practices that have occasionally resulted in formal discrimination complaints and, in a small number of well publicized cases, legal settlements. Well, brands facing this scrutiny have generally denied any deliberate policy of exclusion based on protected characteristics, but the underlying mechanism that makes this kind of judgment call possible in the first place, a locked or attended entrance, a staff member positioned to assess and filter arrivals before granting access, is not a bug in the luxury retail model. It's a structural feature that exists precisely because uncontrolled foot traffic runs directly against the low volume, high attention service model the entire economics depends on. A store built around giving each customer extended, personalized attention simply cannot function if it allows in the same unfiltered flow of browsers a mass market retailer welcomes, which means some mechanism for filtering who comes through the door is, in a sense, built into the model from the start. And the uncomfortable question the industry has had to face repeatedly is whether that filtering has, in specific documented instances, crossed from reasonable capacity management into something closer to discrimination. Let's talk about the part of this business that almost never gets seen by an ordinary walk-in customer at all, because it's the part that generates a disproportionate share of actual revenue, the appointment-only and by referral clientele system operating almost entirely separate from the visible storefront. Many of the highest value transactions at a top luxury boutique happen outside normal walk-in hours entirely. Private appointments scheduled in advance, sometimes with the store closed to the general public for a specific window, sometimes at a client's home or office rather than the store at all. Established relationships between a client advisor and a long-standing customer often involve pieces being set aside, held back for that client before they're ever displayed publicly. Phone calls and personal messages notifying a favored customer the moment something matching their taste has arrived, well before any walk-in visitor would ever see it. This entire layer of the business is essentially invisible from the sidewalk. The empty-looking store you glance into during ordinary shopping hours may represent a small fraction of what that specific boutique actually sells in a given month, with the bulk of high-value transactions happening through relationships and appointments the general public never witnesses at all. One layer of physical design deserves attention on its own, separate from staffing and inventory, because it operates on the customer almost entirely below conscious awareness. Lighting in a luxury boutique is rarely accidental in its color temperature or placement. Retail design consultants working in this space have discussed, in trade publications and industry interviews, calibrating lighting to flatter skin tone and fabric texture simultaneously, typically warmer and softer than the bright, even, cost-efficient, fluorescent lighting found in mass retail, which is chosen primarily to make an entire sales floor visible cheaply rather than to make any single object or person look their best. A single handbag lit from a carefully angled spotlight against a darker surrounding space draws the eye and creates a sense of dimension and value that flat, even lighting across a crowded shelf could never produce. The same museum gallery logic covered earlier applied through light rather than spacing. Sound follows a similar logic. Mass market retail environments frequently use upbeat, higher tempo music intended to move customers through the store efficiently and create an energetic, transactional atmosphere, sometimes credited with modestly increasing spending on impulse categories through pacing effects retail researchers have studied for decades. Luxury boutiques tend to do close to the opposite: curated, low volume, often instrumental music, sometimes no music at all beyond ambient room tone, meant to create a hushed, unhurried atmosphere that discourages the sense of urgency mass retail depends on. The near silence isn't an absence of thought, it's the removal of the sensory cues that would make the space feel like ordinary commerce rather than a considered personal experience, reinforcing every other signal the room is already sending about significance and exclusivity. Window displays follow the identical philosophy, and the contrast with mass retail is often the most visible version of this entire pattern to anyone simply walking down the street. A mass market storefront window typically displays as many items as reasonably fit, mannequins in full outfits, signage about current promotions, and attempt to communicate the full breadth of what's available inside at a glance. A luxury flagship window will often display a single handbag, alone on a pedestal, changed out every few weeks rather than daily, with enormous unused negative space around it. This isn't a missed merchandising opportunity. Visual merchandising specialists in the luxury sector have discussed this directly in industry interviews as a deliberate choice to treat the window itself as an art installation rather than a sales pitch, understanding that a single, beautifully lit object commands more attention from a passerby's glance than a window crowded with options ever could. Applying the same emptiness as signal logic that governs the sales floor to the one part of the store experience that doesn't even require someone to walk inside. Let's talk about how this entire system interacts with online retail, because the contrast reveals something important about what the physical store is actually for in the current retail environment. Most major luxury brands now sell a significant share of merchandise through e-commerce, official brand websites, and, in some cases, authorized resale and marketplace platforms, meaning the physical flagship increasingly isn't the primary transaction channel for ordinary purchases at all. This raises an obvious question. If online sales cover routine transactions perfectly well, what is the enormously expensive physical flagship with its high rent and inverted staffing ratio actually accomplishing? The honest answer, discussed candidly in retail industry analysis, is that the flagship functions primarily as a brand impression engine and a servicing hub for the highest value existing clients rather than as a volume sales channel competing with the website. Foot traffic through the door, even from people who never buy anything that day, generates brand exposure and reinforces prestige positioning in a way no online banner ad can replicate, while the actual highest margin transactions increasingly happen through the appointment and relationship system described earlier, meaning the empty-looking physical store and the busy website aren't competing channels at all. They're serving two almost entirely different functions within the same business. Let me walk through a concrete scenario, because seeing two very different people interact with the exact same store makes clear how differently this system operates depending on who's walking through the door. A tourist we'll call Marcus visits a well-known luxury boutique in a major city while on vacation, curious to see the inside of a brand he's only ever seen advertised. He pushes open the door and the interior is hushed, sparsely furnished, only two other customers visible despite the store's prime location on an expensive shopping street. A staff member greets him politely but with a kind of measured, evaluating attention, and Marcus finds himself unsure whether he's actually welcome to browse or whether he's being quietly assessed for how likely he is to buy anything. He looks at the handful of items on display, feels increasingly uncomfortable in the silence, and leaves within a few minutes without having spoken more than a few words to anyone, later describing the experience to friends as cold, intimidating, and strange for a store that had seemed almost entirely empty the whole time he was inside. Now, compare that to a different customer. A longtime client we'll call Renata, who has been shopping at the exact same boutique for 11 years, initially introduced by a friend who was already an established client there. Renata rarely visits during normal walk-in hours at all. Her relationship is almost entirely managed through a specific client advisor she's worked with for most of that time, who calls or messages her personally several times a year when something has arrived that matches her taste and sizing, and who has, on more than one occasion, arranged a private appointment before the store's public opening hours so Renata can shop without other customers present at all. When she does visit, the same hushed, sparsely furnished space that felt cold and intimidating to Marcus feels, to her, calm and unhurried, because she experiences the exact same physical environment through a completely different relationship with the people inside it. The store didn't change between these two visits. The emptiness Marcus found alienating is the same emptiness that gives Renata's appointments their sense of private, personal service. Same room, same low, visible inventory, same hushed atmosphere, radically different experience, entirely dependent on which side of the store's actual business model each person happened to be standing on. A third perspective is worth adding here. from someone who worked inside the system rather than experiencing it as a customer. A woman we'll call Yuki spent several years as a client advisor at a major luxury house before leaving the industry, and she's been candid in interviews given after leaving the role about how deliberately the appearance assessment and relationship building process was trained into new staff. New hires were taught specific, subtle cues to read within the first several seconds of a walk-in customer entering, not solely about clothing or obvious wealth signals, but about confidence, familiarity with luxury retail norms, whether someone seemed to already understand the pace and etiquette of the space or seemed uncertain and out of place, with staff trained to adjust the intensity and warmth of their initial approach accordingly. She described the commission structure as explicitly rewarding depth over volume, with staff actively discouraged from rushing a promising interaction, even if it meant leaving other browsing customers unattended for extended periods, because a single strong relationship converted over months or years was understood institutionally to be worth vastly more than a handful of quick, one-off transactions with unfamiliar walk-ins. She also noted, candidly, that the sparse, deliberately underfurnished sales floor was a frequent topic in internal training, framed explicitly as a tool, not an aesthetic accident. Staff were taught to understand that the emptiness of the room was meant to heighten the significance of whatever specific item eventually got brought out from the back for a particular customer. Let's talk about why this model has held up so consistently over decades despite looking, on the surface, like it should be commercially self-defeating. The comparison worth making here is to a nightclub with a long line and a bouncer deciding who gets in, a comparison that applies to luxury store access just as directly as it applies to luxury pricing generally. A club that let everyone in immediately would lose the exact quality that made it desirable in the first place. A luxury store that welcomed every walk-in with equal, immediate, high-intensity attention would burn through staff capacity servicing casual browsers who were never going to make a significant purchase, capacity that the model depends on preserving for the smaller number of customers who actually will. The emptiness isn't incidental to the exclusivity, it's the visible proof of it. A room that looks like this must be turning away enough ordinary foot traffic, whether through pricing, atmosphere, or literal door control, to remain this uncrowded on a prime commercial street, and that visible scarcity of other customers becomes, itself, part of what a luxury shopper is paying for when they finally do get personal attention inside. Here's something worth being fair about, because it would be dishonest to frame this purely as manipulation without acknowledging the genuine service quality involved for the customers this model is built to serve. The extended, unhurried attention a serious luxury client receives is, by most accounts, a genuinely superior shopping experience compared to rushed, understaffed mass market retail, real product knowledge, real styling advice, a staff member who remembers your preferences and sizing across years of visits without needing to ask again. The model isn't purely theater, it delivers real value to the customers it's built around, which is precisely what makes it so effective. The exclusivity and the genuine quality of service reinforce each other rather than one being a cover story for the absence of the other. It's also worth noting that this model carries real limits, and not every luxury brand executes it equally well. Some brands have faced public criticism in recent years, discussed openly in fashion and retail trade press, for allowing the exclusivity theater to curdle into something that reads as genuine rudeness rather than considered service, treating walk-in customers with a coldness that generates negative word of mouth rather than the intended sense of aspirational mystique. The line between an atmosphere that feels appropriately hushed and considered versus one that simply feels unwelcoming is thinner than it looks from the outside, and getting it wrong carries real reputational cost in an era where a single viral social media post describing a bad in-store experience can reach an audience the brand never intended to address at all. The empty, quiet store is a deliberate tool, but like any tool, it can be used skillfully or clumsily, and the difference between the two often comes down to the individual staff members' training and judgment in a specific moment rather than anything written into the corporate strategy itself. Here's a 6-part protocol worth understanding, whether you're an occasional luxury shopper trying to get a better experience or simply someone who wants to understand what's actually happening the next time you walk past one of these stores. Rule 1. Understand that an empty luxury store is not evidence the brand is struggling or overpriced relative to demand. It's frequently evidence the opposite. A business model deliberately built around low volume and extremely high margin per transaction. Meaning the emptiness you're seeing through the window tells you almost nothing about whether the business is thriving. Rule 2. If you want a better in-store experience as an occasional shopper, arrive with specific knowledge of what you're interested in rather than browsing vaguely, because staff trained to read confidence and familiarity respond noticeably differently to a customer who signals they know what they want than to someone who seems uncertain why they walked in, regardless of how much money either customer is actually prepared to spend. Rule 3, recognize that most of what's actually available in a given product line is very likely sitting in a back room rather than on the visible floor. So don't assume the handful of displayed items represent the store's full range, and don't hesitate to ask a specific question about availability in a size, color, or style you don't see displayed. Rule 4, if you do become a repeat customer anywhere, understand that building an actual relationship with a specific staff member, remembering their name, following up after a purchase, being a low-friction, pleasant customer to work with, genuinely does shift how you're treated over time in ways that have nothing to do with how much you've spent so far. Because staff compensation in this industry is frequently structured around exactly this kind of long-term relationship building. Rule 5, be aware that appearance-based assessment, however uncomfortable to acknowledge, is a documented, trained practice within parts of this industry, and if you ever feel you've been treated dismissively based on how you look rather than anything you've actually said or done, that reaction is a reasonable one to trust, and in some jurisdictions and cases has been the basis for legitimate discrimination, complaints against specific retailers. Rule 6, remember that the sparse, quiet atmosphere is engineered deliberately to feel significant, and it's worth asking yourself honestly, in the moment, whether a given item feels desirable because of its actual qualities or because of the hushed, reverent presentation surrounding it, since the entire spatial design of the room is built to make that exact distinction difficult to notice in the moment. A useful test is to picture the identical item sitting under ordinary fluorescent lighting on an open shelf next to a dozen similar options, and ask whether it would still feel as desirable stripped of the pedestal, the spotlight, and the silence, because that stripped down version is closer to the item's actual, unassisted appeal than anything you'll ever encounter standing inside the boutique itself. One reframe matters more than the rest here. A luxury store's emptiness is not a passive fact about foot traffic. It's an active, deliberately engineered signal, built on real estate economics that reward margin over volume, a staffing model that inverts ordinary retail logic on purpose, and a physical environment borrowed directly from museum design specifically to make scarcity of visible product feel like evidence of significance rather than evidence of a business struggling to fill shelves. The empty floor and the doorman deciding who gets buzzed in aren't failures of the retail model. They're the retail model, working exactly as intended for the narrow slice of customers it was built to serve, while the visible emptiness itself does a considerable amount of the persuading before a single word gets exchanged with staff. Bijan understood this instinctively decades before most of the industry caught up. A locked door and an empty showroom were never a failure to attract customers. They were the advertisement itself, running 24 hours a day on one of the most expensive streets in the world. 3 takeaways. 1. Luxury flagship stores can occupy some of the most expensive commercial real estate on earth while looking empty because the business model depends on extraordinarily high margin per transaction rather than high foot traffic volume, meaning the emptiness reflects a different underlying economic structure rather than commercial failure. 2. The inverted staffing ratio, more staff attention per customer rather than less, along with deliberately limited visible inventory, are trained, intentional practices designed to heighten a sense of exclusivity and significance around individual items rather than simple operational choices. 3. The majority of high-value transactions at many luxury boutiques happen through appointment only and referral relationships that are almost entirely invisible from the sidewalk, meaning the quiet storefront you glance into represents only a small, visible fraction of the actual business happening behind it. Lazy investing built more fortune than chasing the mystique of an empty boutique ever will. The people who actually get real value out of these spaces aren't the ones intimidated into leaving within minutes, and they aren't the ones fooled into thinking scarcity alone equals quality either. They're the ones who understood exactly which part of the experience was genuine service and which part was theater, and decided, deliberately, whether that theater was worth paying for. If you want to see the exact etiquette guide I put together for getting genuinely helpful service at a luxury boutique on your first visit, there's a walkthrough on my channel with the real details. No guesswork, just what actually works. Thanks for watching.